Hello, everyone. It's great to be back at NACIS, even though I could only make a virtual appearance this time around. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Alex Fries, and I'm coming to you all now from Frederick, Maryland. I currently work as a cartographer for the National Park Service out of Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. But for today's talk, I'm going to talk about something that's completely separate from that work, as this is a project I started on nearly a year before I began working for the Park Service. And that project involved the mapping of rivers all across South America for natural earth and of course some of the challenges that this work inevitably entails. So if you were at my NACIS talk back in 2019, you might recall that I was discussing, the mapping that I was doing of North American river basins. And one of the big things I mentioned in that talk was that in order to quickly stylize rivers and establish a sense of hierarchy on those maps, I relied on Natural Earth's supplemental rivers data set, and especially the scale rank attribute field to make that sort of filtering and visualizing quick and easy. Well, sometime last summer, I began working on a similar project mapping the major river basins of South America. However, from the outset of that project, I was faced with a problem. Natural Earth's coverage of South American rivers was quite a bit sparser, and unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any other cartographic data set as a whole that gave me reliable line work that was attributed with things like river names and scale ranks. So my solution was to just make my own South American data set. And after more than about 1,800 hours or so of work, this is the result so far. A plethora of new river lines at every corner of the continent, painstakingly curated to make sure that river courses and attributes like name and scale rank are correctly and appropriately assigned. Still very much a work in progress as I continue to add new rivers here and there, take out some others where they may not be necessary. But all in all, I'd say it's getting pretty close to a releasable state. So let's give it a little bit of a closer look. Here is the outlet of the mighty Amazon, for example. We see how relatively sparse sampling of tributaries to Earth's largest river is in the original Natural Earth data set. But I've given it an enormous overhaul. Older rivers have had their courses adjusted and corrected, dozens of new ones that have been added that can now be used to make natural maps of South America at a larger scale than was ever previously possible using Natural Earth. It's kind of a similar story down here in the Pampas of Argentina and along the lower Rio Paraná, where I made sure to be mindful of things like the intermittent condition of some of these regions' rivers, as well as various man-made alterations that have noticeably altered the flows of this region's rivers. And you'll also notice in this image, and in the other one as well, that I pay careful attention to assigning stream width attributes on rivers so that you can create a nice tapering effect on those rivers when making your maps, as is the case with all Natural Earth river data sets. So in total, there's about 1,200 rivers in this new data set, and as I said, more to come as I continue working to add rivers in parts of the data set where it might still be a little bit sparse. I'm very happy with where it is now, though, but then again, how exactly did I get to this? So as I've had some time to think about this process over the past couple of months, I've come to realize that the entire project can really be boiled down to three distinct considerations that ultimately had to be grappled with. Most fundamentally, perhaps, was the problem of figuring out which rivers to include in this new data set at all. Only once that was resolved could I then begin mapping river courses and properly attributing them by name. But little did I know that, as we'll soon discuss in a few slides, those last two considerations, river courses and river names, are in fact much more closely intertwined than I ever could have possibly imagined. So the truth of the matter is that when I started working on this data set, I didn't really know all that much about South American rivers. I, of course, knew about some of the larger, more important ones like the Amazon or the Orinoco, the Paraná, or the Magdalena, but beyond that, I was utterly clueless. And so I needed a good way of selecting major drainages out from the continent that could be done systematically and consistently across the whole. And that turned me to HydroShed, the hydro data set from the World Wildlife Fund that I think many of us are already familiar with, if through no other way than on many maps that you probably have seen floating around on places like Twitter or Reddit, highlighting dense stream networks of river basins all around the world. The problem is that at the scale of Natural Earth, HydroShed is way, way, way too dense. That blue color that you see now is not a polygon. That is every single drainage line in South America displayed at once. All right, so HydroShed is way too dense in its default state, but is there a way for me to filter this down into something more usable? And thankfully there is. Although hydrosheds doesn't keep track of attributes like river names, it does keep track of each drainage line's Strehler rank. Now, if you've never heard of the Strehler classification system before, it's basically a method of assigning a hierarchy to rivers. All rivers begin as headwaters with a rank of 1, and when two streams with a rank of 1 merge, they form a rank 2 stream. Two rank 2 streams will then merge to form a rank 3 river, and so on. In many ways, the Strehler method is as much an indication of stream network complexity as it is of river size or importance, but for my purposes, I found that it was perfectly fine for weeding out most, not all, but most of the major rivers of South America from the rest of the dataset. So to do my initial selection, I filtered the dataset so that only drainages with a Strehler rank of at least 6 would appear. And I was actually pretty happy with this initial selection, although it did become obvious to me over time that there were still a couple of things I would need to take care of. One, the fact that this selection doesn't include any headwaters, and two, that the resulting river network still wasn't quite dense enough in some places, so I'd have to go in and manually add additional rivers here and there. And then a third problem came up. Before I could take the hydroshed's data and run it through a simplification and smoothing process to make it more scale appropriate for natural Earth, I started running into stretches of line work in flatter regions that just didn't align with the actual courses of some rivers. So we'll have a look here at these two rivers, the mighty Rio Guaviare and its small tributary, the Rio Uba. Now the Uba is a classic example of the Yazoo Strait that runs parallel to its parent river. In this case, the Uba runs more than 200 kilometers past this point before joining with its parent river. Unfortunately, likely due to the resolution the DEM used to calculate hydrosheds and drainages, the dataset actually merges the two rivers in a place where they clearly do not meet. So this forced me to go in and manually correct the line work so that the two rivers in fact remain separate until their actual confluence much further downstream. In general, when we think about a river that's being drawn on a map with a single line, something like this is probably what we all imagine in our heads. It's got a relatively straight, easy to follow course, likely only a few deviations or peculiarities in the corresponding hydrosheds line that'll need to be corrected. And in full disclosure, I'd wager that about half of the rivers I've mapped in South America were like this one. But as you can imagine, especially in a continent with as much geographic diversity as South America, this was not always the case, not by a long shot. There are some rivers, for example, like the Rio Negro and its enormous river archipelagos, that make it incredibly hard to define a river using that one-line definition you're so used to seeing on maps and in data sets. In a braided network like this, where in the world is someone supposed to put that single solitary line that is going to represent all of this complexity? Do we go with the route that hydrosheds calculated that flows down the single large channel along the southwest that basically bypasses the whole thing? Or do we draw something in new, manually, finding some network of smaller channels that more closely aligns with the approximate center of the river? Now, truth be told, I don't think you can really go wrong with either approach. And while this is a rather extreme example of river braiding, this happens in rivers all across South America, so it's something that must always be kept in mind. And then we run into another problem that's a little bit trickier. Well, even though all the hydroshed lines, or the lines I ended up drawing, are going to end up being simplified and smoothed out anyway, it's still important, I think, that the data we process to begin with is detailed enough that smaller nuances in the shapes of these rivers can be caught and preserved, even after it's been processed. But how much detail is enough? Here is the Rio Mazan, which, as you can see, it meanders quite a lot. Now, in hydrosheds, the line is overall quite accurate, even though this region is in fact very flat, might have otherwise given us problems. But on the day that I added this river to the data set, for whatever reason, I thought this line wasn't good enough to properly capture the true shape of the river. So, for better or worse, I redrew the river almost completely to look something more like this. In hindsight, I'm quite happy with how the new line for this river turned out, even if it ended up being simplified and smoothed anyway. But all that editing and redrawing can take a lot of extra time and effort, and how much detail I put into those edits can vary from river to river and from day to day. So while it may not make a big difference in the final product, since all the lines are going to be simplified and then smoothed anyway, it is something to keep in mind that in this data set, there is always some variance in how accurate and precisely the rivers have been drawn, even if that variance ends up being extremely slight. Meanwhile, there are some rivers that change their courses so rapidly That's almost a guarantee. Any older maps or satellite imagery that we might be using as a reference, they aren't showing the river in its most current state, in which case it's then important for us to find and then use the most up-to-date imagery possible to make sure that the data is accurate. Have a look at this river, the Rio Yapakani. In just 1 year, its course changed from this to this, where one major river bend along that river shifted nearly a mile to the east. Now, at the scale of natural Earth, changes like these aren't going to make much of a dent from year to year, but considering how long it's been since some of the rivers in natural Earth have been updated, you'd be shocked to see how much some of the courses of these rivers has changed. And so it's extremely important for me to make sure that this new data set is as up to date as possible, and also that in the future I maintain my active due diligence to make sure that the data remains as accurate as possible. And then finally, there's just some rivers that are really, really tricky to map, like this one. Can you even see it? There's no worries if you can't, because this particular river, the Rio Bermejo, hasn't flowed all the way to its outlet in over 100 years due to intense irrigation and climate change. But from a natural standpoint, for rivers like this that should flow along a clearly defined path, I still think it's important to map it out somehow anyway, perhaps something like this, which is based on some dried up channels that you can just barely make out when you zoom in very closely on the imagery. So with this work, sometimes you have to just get into the really nitty gritty of the available sources to figure out what's really going on, or at least as well as one can tell using only the internet and GIS software. Changing gears now a bit, something I alluded to previously is the fact that you really can't map a river's course and channels without also being keenly aware of the naming conventions that particular water course has been given. Now, granted, some rivers are remarkably easy to map in this sense. Here, for example, is the São Francisco, which has the exact same name from its headwaters in the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. But sometimes a river's name will abruptly change mid-course. See, I like to add and draw most of the rivers in this data set in the upstream direction, and then use whatever a particular river's name is being applied to guide where I do my digitizing. But what if the river I'm digitizing, like the Rio Purus here, suddenly splits in two, and neither branch uses the original name I was previously referencing, and instead, nominally speaking at least, the river I'm drawing is actually born from the merger of these two distinct rivers? How do you then decide which upstream branch to draw? Well, the answer is, it depends. Context is important with this sort of digitization. Is one of the branches closer in width or color to the downstream stem? Is one of them substantially longer than the other? Or is there one that basically all prior reference maps have more or less designated as the correct headwater? There isn't always a good answer to any of those questions, so sometimes I just go with whatever my gut thinks will look best. And if space permits, I'll sometimes even end up drawing both. And we could take this sort of situation to the absolute extreme. Here is the Babahoyo, one of the chief waterways of Ecuador. Now, what I've highlighted here is what you've probably seen drawn on your average small-scale map of the region, and if it were labeled, it would probably be labeled as the Babahoyo. However, as you probably guessed, things aren't actually that simple. As a matter of fact, only this small portion of the line is the actual Rio Babahoyo. This line is actually comprised of not one, but 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 distinctly named waterways. Now, this is definitely an extreme example, I admit, but it does still happen that what we think of as being one river actually has several different names along its course. And this happens all throughout South America, and especially in rivers that flow through the Andes. Now, although I try to incorporate as many river names as possible in the data set, if a name only applies for an extremely short stretch of river, I usually will just dissolve that particular stretch of the river into an adjacent line so as to reduce noise and clutter. And then something else to consider about river names is that they can also vary quite drastically from country to country. So I highlighted here the main stem of the Amazon, which officially begins at the confluence of the Marañón and the Ucayali rivers in Peru. However, in Brazil, the definition of the Amazon is in fact quite different. In that country, much of the river takes on the name Solimões, not acquiring the name Amazonas until the Solimões unites with the Rio Negro. Natural Earth is quite accommodating for situations like this, thankfully. So all I have to do is assign these portions of the Amazon an alternate name. Place names can be a tricky and sometimes touchy thing to deal with. So I always try to make sure to make use of alternate names whenever I come across, a name that's not maybe, maybe not quite in as much common usage, but it is still regularly used and should be acknowledged. Where exactly did I turn to for all this river name information? Well, as best as I can, I always try to turn to official sources from the governments of each South American nation when it comes to determining river names. And those sources tend to be either official mapping products, especially topographic maps, and various geospatial data sets and databases that are often, but not always, released on the internet for free. All you have to do is search for them in the languages spoken in those countries, and you'll probably find something eventually. But that being said, not all countries in South America have fully mapped out their more remote reaches in great detail. And then there is the case of Venezuela, which perhaps unsurprisingly does not publish any of their geospatial resources onto the internet anymore. So, in less than ideal situations where government based resources simply don't yield anything good for me to work with, I'll then turn to maps from other mapping programs that have been made within the past few decades. These include a variety of US government produced maps of various coverages and scales, as well as the older but still well regarded Soviet topographic maps, which could still be found floating around the internet here and there. Since they're not native sources to the countries being mapped, I'm usually less inclined to treat them as absolutely authoritative. But when there's nothing else to work with, there's still excellent resources for finding this sort of information. Now, having said all that, one thing that you probably realize about this project as I've been talking about it is that there's no such thing as absolution. There are simply inherent limitations and a surprising degree of subjectivity that comes from making a data set that's based on other maps and satellite images and other databases. And these are things that are impossible to completely overcome, short of actually going to South America and personally mapping every single one of these rivers on foot. And in turn, I think this is a truth that could be extended to some degree or another to pretty much any reference data set that we might use to make our maps. Now, of course, I still did my best to try and overcome these uncertainties whenever humanly possible. Now, at times, I might have ended up spending several hours trying to make sure that I had mapped and correctly named even just one river correctly. But I am willing to guess that there are mistakes in this data set. Mistakes are inevitable for a project of this scope and magnitude. But all told, I'm still extremely happy with how it's turned out so far, and I hope to have it released as an official part of Natural Earth within a matter of months. And after that, who knows? If other volunteers are able to help me out here and there, maybe I'll turn my eyes towards Africa and Asia and begin mapping those continents' rivers as well. So I leave you with those thoughts. This project has been an immense part of my life for the better part of a year now, and truth be told, I could ramble on about it for at least a couple more hours. So please, if you have any questions about anything I talked about or anything I said was unclear, please feel free to reach out to me through the conference Slack channels or on Twitter, and I'll be happy to talk with you more about it. Thanks, and I hope you have a great rest of your NACIS.